enjoyed your afternoon of sunshine and boat conversation. I certainly enjoyed talking to those of you I've had the chance to chat with. We're going to extend our conversation now and talk a bit more about what I've loosely called blue water techniques and adventures in the Pacific. We want to sow a few seeds, talk about places that you might want to go sailing on these lovely blue water boats, and cover some of the things you should perhaps add to your cruising repertoire for that reason. Very pleased to have with us on the stage our cruising panel, who've all sailed in the Pacific. Elaine Bunting, editor of Yachting World, was lucky enough to go and do some filming out in the Pacific on blue water techniques with Dan Bauer, who's also on the panel with us. And then we've got Mike and his wife Liz, who are here, who sailed their Hamburg 42 through the Pacific. And I've asked Robert from Admiral Marine, who's a catamaran sailor. So Robert has migrated from racing dinghies to cruising catamarans. So we've got a selection of experience, which I'm hoping to bring out from the panel. This is audience participation. So, I see everyone's shrinking back now and thinking, oh, thank God we sat at the back. It's a question and answer panel. You're very welcome to ask questions. If there's particular topics that you'd like the panel to discuss, by all means, please ask. I'm going to keep the conversation going. I'm going to get these guys talking. If that stimulates some thoughts or ideas from you, please join the conversation. And also, if there are places that you've been or the information you'd like to contribute to the group, please do so. It's not exclusively these guys. It's all about the room. It's about talking on sailing and talking about cruising. So, unfortunately, we only have one microphone, so I'm going to hand it over to Robert to begin with. Before we do that, I'm going to, again, you can't see, there's a lovely picture of the Pacific there. Oh? What I'm going to try and do, our panel I've just introduced, so thank you to the panel. I'm going to try and set the scene a little, if you can, if it all works. This worked earlier. Can you describe it? Oh yes, here we go. Right. Technology and tents don't seem to go well together, do they? One thing you will learn as blue water cruisers is the joy of Wi-Fi. You'll be spending all your time hunting for Wi-Fi so you can do your emails to talk to people. But it doesn't all... it's now... Here we go. Doing its thing. Okay. So what you are looking at there is a lovely video of the Pacific, which isn't playing very well. But you've got the soundtrack. I'll give up on that. What I was trying to show you there was a little colour, a little view of the Pacific from one of the video clips that Yachting World has done from their cruising. Elaine, would you like to just brief us on what it was you were doing with these little video projects and why you were in the Pacific?
Can I do the sitting down? Okay, so we've for about the last 4 years we've run an annual series of kind of practical features in Yachting World with videos that we are running online. We started off with some techniques about setting up twin headsails, preventers, helming downwind, reaching and so on, called Sail Safer, Sail Faster, which you can find on our website. Now we followed that up with one that we did with Skip Novak. We sailed around Cape Horn with him and we looked at some heavy weather techniques from his bitter experience. Again, we're relaunching that online. Please do go and have a look. So that was terribly interesting. And then last year we were lucky enough to get some backing again from our sponsors Pantanius to go and sail with Dan on his yacht Skylark in Fiji, and to look at some of the skills that you need to sail in the Pacific. To my mind, those are quite complementary to what you would be doing for crossing the Atlantic. So it takes another stage. You're looking at things like eyeball navigation and coral, conning way into lagoons, thinking about areas in which the weather is a little bit more variable, some of the anchoring techniques you need to use where there are coral heads. So it's almost like an extension of what you might need to use crossing the Atlantic. We looked at all sorts of things like using your tender, fishing, snorkeling on reefs, and some of these other things that you might want to do for pleasure as well as by necessity. So again, that's running at the moment in Yachting World. That carries on to September, and those videos are all online. Go and have a look, and we'll be publishing Dan's fantastic articles on these subjects on the website as well if you read the magazine. And next year, if those of you are looking at multi-hulls, we'll be following that up with a long series on multi-hull sailing, which is also quite interesting from a monohull point of view, and we've learned quite a lot from doing that this year. So that's it.
Interesting stuff. Thank you. Is that working? Have we got voice? Shout. So I want to talk about, to start with, to ask you about your views on the Pacific as opposed to the Caribbean. We've talked a lot about sailing the Atlantic and getting to the Caribbean. How would you say, Mike, I'll start with you, how would you say the Pacific is different in terms of sailing or in terms of the places you go to? How would you sum up some of the differences that you found?
Fuzzy, is that loud enough? Okay. Clearly the obvious one is the distances involved. In the Pacific you've got certain pockets, so you get to the Galapagos and there's certain places so you can sail around the Galapagos. If you've got cruising permit, etc., you then go to the Tuamotus, you could sail around there. There's the Marquesas, you could sail around there. And then you've got Society Islands, sail around there. Cooks a little bit, but they're fairly spaced out. And then you've got Tonga, Fiji, etc. So you've got pockets, but the distance between those pockets is significant. Say several hundred miles, 600 miles, 500 miles, maybe 900 miles. So you've got to do those distances. And I think that is the biggest thing. Also, clearly there isn't anywhere to get things fixed in the same degree as there is in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, obviously, you've got islands 60 miles apart or thereabouts, so if you can't get it sorted in one of those islands, you can go to another island without too much difficulty, or you can get things flown in from one island to another. Not so easy in the Pacific. And so you tend to need to have an awful lot more spares than you would do perhaps if you were just in the Caribbean. Also, there was certainly messages about how expensive that French Polynesia was going to be. And so in Panama, everybody stocked up with as much as their boats could carry. The boats all went down in the water quite significantly. So people sort of provisioning for maybe 4, 5, 6 months, just simply because when they knew when they got there it was going to be very, very expensive. You'd come out of Panama supermarket thinking, crikey, I've got 3 or 4 trolleys, and then the guy next to you has got 10 trolleys. It was that sort of packing up.
I don't recall any stories of cruising sailors ever starving on board their boats.
No, that they certainly didn't. So I think the distances and the lack of ability to get things fixed easily.
Dan, I know you spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, you've done a lot of transatlantics. How did you find, if you like, the ease of cruising in the Caribbean, or the variety of places you were going? Did you feel there was a significant difference?
I think Mike's pretty much hit it on the head with the distances everything is apart is a big change. The Pacific is huge and there's so much that's interesting there, and the islands you can go to, they really are very different, so that's nice. You do get that variety in the Caribbean, but everything's a bit closer, everything's quite similar in how civilised it is. Whereas the Pacific, you really get the chance to get off that track. You can go to places where you are the only boat in the bay, and that's pretty hard now. Caribbean, you almost never find that, even off-season, but the Pacific you really can, and that's what made it so special. But the distances are huge, and that's the big difference.
And did you prepare for if you're crossing between islands, was that the same as did you treat each of those as an ocean passage? What was your sort of approach to running the boat on the cruise?
Yeah, I mean, within the groups themselves are quite big. The group in time between islands, you can still be on a 2-day passage, whereas in the Caribbean it's raining more than overnight. And the same in Fiji. In Fiji, it's a massive place. When we planned it, it's just a name that you hear. We have no idea. We didn't know how big it was around Fiji. It was massive. And so when you're doing the inter-island trips, it's less so. But between the groups, yeah, everything's maybe a 4-day sail. You have to think about it in the same way, more like an ocean passage, less like a little island hop, where in the Caribbean you just up anchor at the end of the day and maybe do a poodle overnight to the next island and you're there. Pacific, it's not the same. You really have to think about it, plan it. Also plan with the customs and when you can actually clear in and out. You know, you have to plan for a whole day to clear out of some of these islands. When you arrive, you can't arrive at the weekend or it becomes difficult. So it's a lot more planning involved.
But worthwhile for where you get to.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a magical place. You can spend years there and really enjoy it.
So one key thing, I mean, saying what the issues are, but one of the beauties is the fact that Caribbean, nearly always wind on the beam or ahead of the beam, whereas the Pacific, it's behind the beam most of the time, virtually all the time. So it's downwind sailing, it's proper downwind sailing. Remember in the Caribbean, the only downwind sail that we really did was from Antigua to Nevis. But once you get in the Pacific, it's all downwind sailing, and it's great.
Robert, you did some lovely downwind passages on your 43-foot catamaran. How would you describe the sailing that you did?
The sailing was pretty amazing. We found that the first 600 miles or so to Galapagos was virtually windless. And then we had to go about another 800 miles before we picked up trades. So there was an awful lot of motoring, and what people sometimes forget is you do need to carry quite a lot of extra fuel. Most of the boats that we were with had bladders on their decks for extra fuel, and it's definitely worth having because you don't really want to get stuck waiting for the wind to come up. Downwind sailing was great. We used a Genoa and a main. I had 2 quite old spinnakers and I was nervous about putting them up. And when we did put them up, they tore almost immediately. So we kept up the white sail downwind sailing. In hindsight, I think we would have been better off with a small, bulletproof spinnaker or a parasailer because it covers you for a large cross-section of winds, and we would have experienced a lot less wear and tear in the sails. When we got to Australia, the mainsail was pretty worn out, a lot of chafe, which was unavoidable.
Was the sail, how old was your main before you set out?
Well, that was possibly one of the problems. The main was probably about 5 years old, and it was already quite tired. It was still fine, but it was not really any good for any sort of good windward work afterwards.
I'd just like to bounce that question to the other 2 boat owners there. Did you find that you wore out sails crossing the Pacific?
Not at all in our particular case, because we'd rigged for downwind sailing. We did the Ark in '95.
Thinking more in terms of like UV degradation, or just because you're always sailing, did that put a strain on the sail?
Not really, not as far as we go. We left in 2008 with new sails, which might have made a difference. We were also, we've got twin headsails, one just behind the other, and 2 poles on the rig, on the mast, so we could pole both sails out. So downwind, the main wasn't used. So our main is actually in pretty good condition because it didn't get so much use. And I think that the strains on the boat when you are running are quite different to the strains if you're not.
We found that we had a fairly traditional rig, so we had a full mainsail, we had a big Genoa out in the pole. We did use spinnakers from time to time, but that was more towards the end of the Pacific where the winds got lighter. We didn't necessarily have the same wind holes that you had. Actually, we found it was upwind to the Galapagos, so obviously there wasn't much wind, but the fact it was upwind meant we could sail. And in general, the wear and tear was much less than we would have anticipated on a Atlantic crossing. The swells were, from our experience, were much, much smaller. The boat was more comfortable, and so we didn't have the same chafe issues, we didn't have the same wear and tear issues. We went into the Pacific with our sails, our main sails probably 4 years old. We had a new Genoa, but our main sail had done, would be 3 Atlantic circuits, that's 6 Atlantic crossings, and it's still fine. So we didn't feel the same way on that, but it could be that we had an easy year in the Pacific. I mean, we had full main most of the time. To put it in perspective, I generally cross the Atlantic with 2 or 3 reefs in, but we're fairly cautious. So it was a different kind of sailing for us.
Elaine, I'd like to ask you about weather. We had a conversation earlier about the differences in weather, and I think you had some thoughts on the variety of weather that you can experience in the Pacific. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, the thing about the Pacific is it doesn't, we're making it sound very difficult. I'll come back to that because it's an amazing place to go, but it doesn't always live up to its name. The Pacific, I think that's fair to say. It's not like the Atlantic where you can expect trade winds at some point, as variable as that is year on year. The Pacific's completely different. So let's say you go through the traditional season, that will take you through the Panama Canal in February, March. So then you get a spell of really good, quite generally speaking, good reliable southeasterly trade winds from the Galapagos to the Marquesas. And there's another typically reliable period of better winds in the Coral Sea at the other end. In between, it can be very variable, and that depends whether it's an El Nino year or it isn't. And what you get can vary quite a bit. For example, let's say between the Marquesas and the Coral Sea, which it's a big chunk of half the world, you might get steady winds for 2 or 3 days, and then you might get a pattern of thunderstorms, and you're getting affected by weather fronts stretching upwards from the Southern Ocean. So it can be quite variable. It can vary year on year. It's you might have a bit of motoring. You might have it varies a fair bit, and it's much as you do get a lot of downwind sailing. It's by no means the trade wind 16 to 25 knots from 120 degrees behind you sort of thing. No, it varies a bit.
I'd just like to ask Mike, what did you do for weather forecasting? Where did you get your weather from, or your weather forecasts from?
Just before I go to that one, just to sort of say a bit more about what's just been said. We had a year of reinforced trades across the Pacific, and ours was nothing like Dan's by the sounds of it. We had some very strong winds at times, and it stayed strong winds right away across the Pacific. I remember we were in Bora Bora, and it never stopped blowing 25 knots, and snorkeling in that, a bit like being in a washing machine. We had 3 days in the crossing from the Galapagos to the Marquesas, where we just had the storm jibber, and we still made 155 miles a day. We certainly had quite a lot of cross seas as well. So it was a great run, but it wasn't always the most comfortable, and it certainly wasn't the way that Dan had described it. So I think depending on the year, you can have quite different conditions. Weather forecasting, we used passage weather a lot of the time. We used grid files a lot of the time. Those were the main ones. There's 1 or 2 people that did extra weather work. I'm just trying to think. The guy from New Zealand, whose name is Bob McDavitt, used to do one that we used to pick up on, all through sail mail, mostly all through sail mail.
Robert, were you using a weather forecasting service, or just picking up weather faxes or grids? What were you?
We were using grid files a lot, and I found them really good. Picking them up using a product called, I think it's called US Grid, or Grid US, I think it's called. Pick it up over an Iridium system. I wasn't able to download, I was hoping to be able to pick up stuff by the SSB, but that wasn't really working terribly well. that was our main source of weather. And the thing about the Pacific, which immediately was different to the Caribbean, is that winds do vary quite a bit. And you experience sometimes a wind going around 180 degrees, and you could go into a harbour like somewhere like in Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, and you think you're absolutely fine. And then literally 24 hours later, the wind has changed direction, and suddenly you're on a lee shore and you need to get out as quickly as possible. So you do have to be quite sort of on the ball about the weather. And even little islands like Niue, where you're moored in the lee of the island, if the wind does change, you need to get out quite quickly. So you always have to be tuned into the weather.
That does kind of move us on nicely to anchoring. Any advice for the audience based on your experience of anchoring in you mentioned being prepared for wind shifts? Did you do any different anchoring arrangements to plan for that? Or?
Well, everyone has different views about anchors and anchoring. My personal tip is to use as much chain as you've got, much more than they recommend. Can't see any reason for not using plenty of chain. I'm a great believer in these sort of second or third generation anchors that they've brought out now, which are really efficient. Slightly wearing my insurance hat, which I'm not really allowed to wear.
You can wear it.
We do come across quite a few production boats where they put an anchor on which is frankly insufficient. And people think, oh, I don't really want to upgrade my anchor, but it's a huge mistake that. A boat like an Oyster 56, for example, would come with a 75-pound CQR, which I'm afraid is completely inadequate. You need to go up to something more powerful. I don't know whether you'd agree with that or not, something which is maybe 110 pounds and go to a third generation anchor, and then you've got some real holding power. And we've had boats that have actually dragged, and they've damaged their anchor. We paid them for a new CQR, and they've paid the extra to have the heavy-duty anchor. And since that replacement has taken place, they've never ever dragged again, and they've just said they wish they did it from day one. Sure, other people.
Yeah, I do just want to say something about anchoring, because it's a perennial subject for yachting magazines, and I don't honestly know over how many years we've managed to get so many pages out of it. It really is. I've sailed with an awful lot of people in a lot of places over the years, and I've anchored with Skip Novak and Cape Horn in 65 knots of wind, and it really is incredibly simple. It's just like what Robert says, you need a really huge anchor. It doesn't need to be even a CQR is absolutely fine. You need masses of chain, a good heavy chain, and a good heavy anchor, and put lots of it out, and you'll have probably a perfectly reasonable night's sleep. I don't think there's anything else to say about anchoring. We've had lots of it. There's a great video by Skip Novak, and there's a great video by Dan about a technique I've no doubt he'll tell you about in a minute. But the basics of it is that you just have a great big anchor and lots of chain. In the Pacific, you do need a lot. You're anchoring in very deep places like the Marquesas, which are, some of those anchorages are 50 meters.
Yeah.
Would there be 50? Nukuhiva, I think you're anchoring in very deep water there. So you do need a lot of it in the Pacific, and that's your insurance policy. Things like these two anchors in tandem and that. I've never heard anybody that did any serious sailing that puts any store by that. It really is pretty simple. And Dan, if I may pass it on to you, does have a really good technique for the Pacific to make sure you don't snag these coral heads when the wind shifts, as it does, by 180 degrees and you have to get out.
Thank you. Yeah, as Elaine says, the main thing in the Pacific that's different is the depth of water. And again, our anchor is just a standard CQR. The boat came with a lovely polished stainless CQR, and I just can't get myself to get rid of it. I do hear very good things about the Rockner anchors in the third generation that Robert's talked about, but we just go, ours is quite a big anchor, lots of chain, and throw it all down. But as Elaine said, one of the issues in the Pacific particularly is that you're often anchoring in an area that's strewn with coral heads. You're not anchoring on a reef, you're anchoring in a bay, but in amongst that bay you've got big coral heads which come up from the surface. The problem with that is that when you anchor and you get these wind shifts we've all talked about, is the boat goes round and round and you wrap all of your chain around these coral heads, which shortens the scope of the chain. When the boat then tries to pull back in a gust, the anchor's going straight down, straight round a coral head, and there's no spring left, there's no spring in the chain, and you damage something. The coral doesn't break, the chain doesn't break, so it's generally something further up the line, your bow roller, your anchor snubber, maybe your windlass even can go. So the technique that we kind of stole from other cruisers that are out there is that as you're putting the chain down in these coral areas, is you buoy the chain every so often with little floats. Traditionally fenders are used, but our fenders are far too big for this and the anchor won't even go anywhere near the bottom. So we found these small fishing floats that we would use, and you drop the first maybe 20 metres down to the seabed, and then you would put a buoy every 10 metres after that. And what you'd find is that if you look at the profile of the chain, it would just kind of come up and just sit just above the seabed, not trying to get it up to the surface, but as the boat swings around, that nice big amount of chain you've got out, because as Robert says, we've let everything out, you know, you've got a big scope there to wrap around the seabed, just keeps it above the coral heads, so that when you come to pull the anchor up, you don't have to unwind yourself from all of these little obstacles that you've got. And that's quite important, because when the wind does shift, and you do tie yourself in knots, and you want to get out of there, you want your anchor to come up, you don't want it to be twisted around everything. Otherwise, you're in the very unfortunate position of staying put, or leaving your anchor and going away, and that's an expensive mistake.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that as well. I don't know if you used a big snubber. That's one of the things that we've always used is a snubber, but make it very long. And that if you do get it caught up around the coral head, then that takes the all the stresses and strains rather than your gear.
Moving on slightly from anchoring, I'd just like to ask the panel about the equipment they had on their boat. Were there things that you put on because you were going to the Caribbean that didn't really use the full benefit that you got to the Pacific in terms of cruising gear? I think maybe solar panels or power generation or self-steering. Was there anything like that that you had and thought, I'm glad I've got this, but you didn't use it until you transited?
I think we found only the opposite actually. Some of the stuff that we had in the Caribbean was very useful, like a wind generator. I think it sounds like we had a very benign Pacific trip, but our wind generator was fairly useless. In the wind that we had when you're sailing downwind at 8 knots and you've only got 20 to start with, then the wind generator really didn't do a lot, and the same in the anchorages. Places like the Marquesas, you're in the lee of the hills, so you don't get much breeze in that. That's what we found. But after coming through the Pacific, we've certainly given more thought to what we'd put on next time. And solar panels, and also for all the miles, one of these water at sea hydrogens that...
Can you just explain what they are for people's benefit?
Yeah, the water at sea, or the hydrogens, what do you call the hydrogens? They're like a propeller that you put off the back of the boat, and they seem to be an amazingly efficient generator. I really couldn't believe it. People were telling me about how wonderful this was. It will give you 30 amps when you're sailing along doing 6 knots, and I thought this was nonsense. I also thought it would slow the boat down quite a lot. So last year, when we were coming back from the Azores, there was a little boat next to me, not really little, but a bit smaller than we were, and he had no generator, his alternator had failed, and he told me he was just going to sail back to Europe using his generator on the back, and I thought, well, good luck to him. And I thought it'd be a lot slower. Anyway, we set off together, and lo and behold, somewhere off the Needles, there he was, sat right behind me, plenty of power, generator working all the way, and to be honest, I didn't really have any excuses, so I turned my AIS off and hid in Yarmouth so he couldn't come and find out about how well it'd done. But anyway, they really do seem to work, and if you're going to do a lot of passage making, obviously it makes sense because you really do get the power. And we don't have the luxury of maybe a wind vane steering, so if we're not hand steering, we use the autopilot. A lot of big drains, keeping your beer cold in the Pacific is quite a feat in itself. So the more power you can get, the better. And we found the traditional things that we had that had worked very well in the Atlantic, wind generator and a diesel generator. Those things didn't work so well in the Pacific. The diesel generator, because you can't get any spares. And anyone that has sailed an ocean will probably tell you that the first thing that fails is your diesel generator. I'm sorry to the guys at Fisher Panda at the back there, but it does seem to be the case. The one thing that we would actually suggest is having an auxiliary generator as well. We had a little Honda petrol thing on deck, and that did work. Our main generator, it wasn't a Fisher Panda, it was an Italian thing, and maybe that might say temperamental. But we did have a lot of problems with it, so that's the main thing we changed, I think.
I think you're very sensible having an alternative form of power generation, because we come across quite a few boats that get hit by lightning. Sorry, it's not all gloom and doom. I'm not allowed to talk about the gloom and doom, but if you do have another alternative means of producing power, it does take a lot of pressure off, because it buys you time, and small generators is a very good idea, I think. The one thing that I thought was useful in the Pacific that wasn't needed in the Caribbean is the need to have some extra jerry cans and also some sort of hand pump or some sort of system you use for siphoning fuel, because there are occasions when you go to very remote islands where you can't sort of go into a marina and fill up. You have to actually go ashore to a petrol station, get your diesel, bring it out in the dinghy, and that's when you need a system for getting the fuel out of your jerry can into your fuel tank without splashing it all over the day. So that's something that I found quite useful. I'm sure you probably had that on your boat already.
I'll second that, it's very important.
Mike, have you got any equipment comments to add to that?
Along the same sort of lines, I suppose. And we left the UK with one solar panel and we came back with 3. We certainly use that. I think also going across the Pacific, we tended to use our hydrovane a lot more than we did in the Caribbean or the Atlantic. I think it's probably because we got to understand it by then and it was really working quite well. And what we found that we could do was use the hydrovane but have the autopilot on its least sensitive setting, and we would run the 2 together. And the hydrovane, every so often when we got big cross seas, which we did get, if we got a really big one, then the hydrovane would lose it and wouldn't recover. But having the autopilot on its least setting caused it to come back on course, and so the auto helm sort of looked after the hydrovane. The hydrovane steered most of the time, and you could see that the wheel was hardly moving. The autopilot was drawing hardly any amps at all. Knocked off. That's when that came into play, and that combination worked extremely well. But we didn't discover it until the Pacific.
That's quite an interesting point you raised there about you were learning as you were going. So I just kind of like ask the panel a little bit about, I know Robert, we had some conversation earlier about your level of knowledge you need to be able to tackle something like this, and where you learn your lessons. Did you treat your Atlantic crossing as your, if you like, your blue water cruising nursery, and the Pacific was your secondary school? So just kind of a little comment on the level of experience or knowledge you feel you need to be a blue water cruiser.
Well, I think one particular thing that I've already mentioned to a degree is the fact of our double-headed rig. We did the Atlantic back in '95, '96. And a number of times that we had to move the pole. We had one pole, we moved it from one side to the other, which is a conventional rig in those days. I said, if I'm ever going to do this again, I'm going to have 2 poles and 2 headsails. And so we were lucky enough to be able to do that, and that's what we ended up with because of what we'd learned. And effectively that '95, '96 meant our whole boat for the 2008, which is when we left the UK, did the Ark in 2008 and then carried on going around. That 95, 96, all that we learned from that went into the design of the boat that we effectively went around the world in.
I just want to make a sort of general observation about going off blue water voyaging. I think it was, I'm not sure who it was, I think Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or you can't is true. And I've met lots of people who've been talked to them as they've been around the world, and I think by the time you get to somewhere like the Pacific, you probably know what you need to know. I talked to a couple who'd done the World Ark a few years ago, and they had set out from the UK, and they got as far as Portugal, and they realised they needed some help and tuition, and they wanted to go back and learn a little bit more about learning to reef. And I met them when they'd sailed around the world, just two-handed in a 38-foot boat. So they had no problems at all. They learned as they went along. They were, as you all are, very practical, common sense people who will acquire the skills that you need at every stage. I don't think that's a problem. The only thing that tends to be a little bit more difficult that other people have touched on in the Pacific is you do need to learn how to fix things, make do and mend for the Pacific, because whatever you have on board, you won't be able to fix under warranty work. You will not have people come out to the Pacific to fix it. So you need to think in terms of redundancy or being able to do without things a lot more than the Atlantic. But there's no one way of doing it. There's no one rig that is, there's all sorts of ways of skinning a cat really, and I don't think there's anything magical about going through and into the Pacific. You only need to just bear in mind that probably once you go through the Panama Canal, you're going to have to carry on. It's tough to do a U-turn and come back. So you need, the only one thing I think that you need for the Pacific is you need to like ocean sailing, because it's about ocean passage making. So if you really don't like being at sea for 8 or 10 days and you discover that in the Atlantic, then probably the Pacific's not for you, but certainly you can do it.
What was I saying?
I spoke to Jeremy beforehand and explained that there are a lot of people here who are really experienced sailors. They've been sailing, long distance blue water cruising for about 30 years, and to them it comes completely naturally. And from my experience, an awful lot of people go off on these trips who don't have that much experience, and so it can seem rather nerve-wracking. But in our case, we were basically a bunch of dinghy sailors. Never went across the Atlantic because we bought the boat in America, and we brought the boat from Texas down to Antigua, which was actually a reasonable distance, but it wasn't like going across the Atlantic. And our crew consisted of people who basically I'd sailed with in dinghies and later in boats like Hunter 707s in the Solent. And they were not blue water cruisers at all, but we found that because we could sail and we understood the wind and the tides, it was the sailing side of it was a doddle. And so the only real requirement for us was to become a little bit more resourceful and become better at repairing things, which you do have to do on a fairly regular basis. So don't be put off by the fact that you have done 2-3 circumnavigations, because everyone who's contemplating a trip like this has to sort of start from somewhere, and the Pacific has got to be the best place in the world to sail, in my opinion.
Yeah, I just want to second that. There's nowhere else you can sail in the world that's more amazing than the Pacific. I think we might have missed that somewhere in all the difficulty, but it is quite incredible. It's half the world, and the cultures are amazingly different, like you said, and the experiences that you look for when you're cruising, people that don't see so many people from outside, villages where people visit seldom, and there's this is where you're going to see them.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't need to be doom and gloom, but we make it sound difficult. It really isn't. I've been reading a book at the moment which is called Brave or Stupid. It's 2 guys that set off, I think they're Swedish, 2 electricians. They met on a cycling holiday. They decided they were going to go and sail around the world, and they hadn't ever sailed before, so they did a few sailing school lessons. They bought a small boat, they called it their beginner boat. It's a 30-footer, and they sailed around the North Sea in that. And then 2 years later they set off on their Halberg Rassi, I think it was at 42 as well. And it's a very good book. It just shows that actually, if you want to go and do it, you can learn everything you need to do, and you can just get on and do it. And I think the key thing on the boat is the redundancy aspect. You don't need to be able to fix everything, you just need to be able to cope. What you will find is that when you get to these anchorages, there are people that are willing to help you. Doing something like the World Arc is amazing for that. You arrive and you say on the radio, oh, I broke this, and someone will know how to fix it. Someone will come and fix it. Give them a beer or so. Or if you go around and you're cruising and you have a bit longer, you'll meet a whole community of people that will do this for you. But you do have to have the redundancy to actually get to that next port and not worry too much that you haven't got as much fresh water as you might have liked, or that kind of thing. But it's not inachievable. Just if you want to go and do it, just go and do it, I think.
Yeah, one other thing about the Pacific, we were told that when you go through Panama, you'll never need to lock your dinghy. And we went through Panama and we never locked a dinghy until we got to Australia, and we never needed to. Compared with the Caribbean, where you sort of lock it or lose it, it is quite different and very relaxing and a lovely place to sail.
A couple of people have mentioned self-reliance, and would you say that's the key mark of a blue water cruiser, regardless of where you're going to be cruising?
Is it the key mark of a blue water cruise? I don't think there is a key mark, but it certainly makes your life a lot easier if you don't need to stop what you're doing, you don't need to panic, and you don't need to lose sleep because something isn't working. I think the more you can have redundant systems, or just sheer simplicity, or do without. This is almost an unknown concept in the modern world with boats getting more and more complicated. You can do without. It is still possible to catch rainwater. Things like that. There are simple techniques that often get overlooked and forgotten. And you definitely, particularly in the super yacht world, you do find super yachts sitting in port when they had cruises and people placed and all expensive crew all lined up because the garbage compactor isn't working. You know, you can't put your foot in the bin and crush it down. You know, do you know what I mean? So even at the amateur level, it is possible to do without. And I think those are things at the planning stage are definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah, one other thing, Dan said that you need to have resilience to be able to get to the next port of call. But one thing we did discover that there are very few places that FedEx can't find you. So if you are really desperate, you can get things flown in. It might cost you a bit of money, but we've had various things flown in lots of different places, and it can be done.
Yeah, I think the key on that is to have friends join you very regularly along the route. Just make sure they know that they can bring a small bag for them, but really it's going to be a slightly bigger bag of fuel spares. We were very lucky in the World Up. We had lots of people joining us all of the time, and so we didn't need the FedEx. But my sister was slightly concerned when I sent her a windlass to bring out. So you do have to be a bit careful.
We had every single spare you could think of, but the one thing I forgot to take was a main halyard. And our main halyard failed about 100 miles off Fiji. But we were lucky. There was a chandlery in Fiji where you could buy exactly the right specification halyard, so it wasn't really a problem.
I'd like to move on a bit now and talk a little bit about some of the places. We've thrown these names around: Rarotonga, Fiji, Tahiti. From your experience, are they all the same? Is it just another island with palm trees, or what's the variety that you get out there?
I may as well start. There's an immense variety, in my opinion. You know, the contrast between the Marquesas and the Tuamotus, which are the first two places you come to after Galapagos, is huge. Totally different culture. I personally love the Tuamotus because they're very low-lying islands, wonderful people, a mixture of Polynesians and Chinese, because there were a lot of Chinese pearl farmers out there, and incredibly friendly. You turn up and you're a sort of great novelty factor, and if you're prepared to sort of organise a few games for the children, you've made their day basically, and you go through these passes, which are it's a bit like going up a river where the tide comes through quite strong, and once you're inside this lagoon, which is actually the centre of a crater, you can drop your anchor and it's beautifully quiet. It's just like sort of going into a lake really, and often these islands are just the most beautiful places. And further down the line you've got places like the Cook Islands, places like Suvaro, which I'm told is absolutely amazing. I didn't actually go there because I went to Rarotonga. You could spend 3 months just exploring Fiji. I think it's all so varied, and French Polynesia is very sophisticated. I think every place has got something to commend itself.
I would just, I totally agree with that, and all the islands are so different. For me, the Marquesas was one of the most special places that I've been to. Very volcanic and with really interesting culture, interesting people, but they are all different. But we are still only talking about the coconut milk run, which is that trade, the more what you think of a trade winds route across the Pacific. But you've got to the north and to the south, you've got lots of other areas. You've got all the way down to Easter Island, Pitcairn. You've got Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Caroline, Marshall Islands. So those all have their own separate culture. So I think the one thing that I would say about the Pacific is that the traditional seasonal route, going through Panama again, February, March, then you have to be in the Torres Strait by September to be out of the cyclone, to be away from the cyclone zone. It is a very short time to cover half the world. So if you really want to explore the Pacific, something you really need to think about is whether you're going to spend 2+ years there. It's a big area to rush through, and that's a whole other topic, where you go or do you leave your boat there in the cyclone season. But it's something to bear in mind if you want to really explore these different cultures, because as Dan said, areas like Fiji you could spend months in Fiji happily, and you could go from island to island and find differences between the culture even within island groups. So as I say, it's half the planet, and I think that you need to think about whether you want to spend a little bit more time there or rush through to Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
What's your favourite place that you went to?
You know, it's almost an impossible question to answer because there is just so much in the Pacific and it is so different. And the amount of time we spend in the islands, we came through fairly quickly. We did the World Arc route, so we came through in one season. We did a lot in that. I think as part of doing that route, you do a lot more, maybe in that one season than some people do in 2 or 3, because when you arrive somewhere, you've got a week there, and you fix the boat up best you can, and you do go out, and you can see everything you can and do that. But it is so different. I mean, the Marquesas are completely different to the Tumotos. I mean, they're, 400 or 500 miles apart, but you couldn't compare them. Marquesas, fantastic waterfalls, walking, hiking. Tumoto's amazing diving. So you can't really choose which one you prefer. So I think it's very difficult. I think you just have to go and experience them all, do the whole thing.
Mike, any favourite places or islands you prefer?
Well, one thing just generally about the Pacific, again, about the people, is you walking down the road, and if they're across the other side of the street, they will say hello. And wherever you go, people wanted to talk, wanted to say hello, and it was so friendly from that point of view. And then you come back to sort of the more western side, where if you started to talk to someone across the other side of the street, they would think you were somewhat strange. But it's that sort of culture. In terms of sort of Fiji, which we loved, you said you could spend months there. We spent 4 months there, and we only really touched the eastern side. We did do the Asamas, but we did them very quickly, which is on the western side. I think you could go to Fiji 4 or 5 seasons and probably still not stop in the same place twice. It's a huge area, in terms of favourites, again, impossible to say. We loved it all, different things, different areas.
Can I just ask about charts and pilots? It's a fairly remote area. Did you have trouble getting the right charts? Did you find you swapped charts out there? What was your approach to that side of it?
From our point of view, no, we knew roughly, obviously, where we were going. We had a corridor, and that corridor across the Pacific, we had paper charts that we'd got from Kelvin Hughes, most of them. We had electronic charts as well, so we had paper charts for the main corridor, and if we went off that corridor, then we used the electronic charts as best we could. But the charting certainly was, probably going off topic here, but the charting in some areas is certainly very poor. Again, Fiji particularly, where they just let it go. And you can certainly be, on the electronic charts, we use Navionics Gold, looking at the chart, you were on land. I mean, you clearly weren't because you were in the water, but the boat, as far as the chart was concerned, was on land. And then we had all sorts of other mechanisms to sort of do that, Google Earth being the primary one, but that's probably another topic as we go on.
Dan, do you want to just talk a little bit about coral navigation and going into these places? It's something you talk about in your wonderful video clip.
Yeah, I mean, as Mike said, the charts are pretty awful. Happily, they get progressively, well, they don't get worse. It gets harder to navigate as you come across the Pacific. So it's a little bit baby steps at first, and then by the time you get to somewhere like Fiji, you've got a lot more experience and knowledge about what you're going to do. Key problem with the charts is they weren't very well done in the first place, and then coral does move, so reefs move, coral heads grow. So you've got a chart from 150 years ago, it's not going to be that accurate. To put it in perspective, in Fiji, Sunset and Moorings had bases there, and they lasted about a season. They lost so many boats on the reefs there. So this was people going out and just not really being aware of what they need to think about. It really all comes down to eyeball navigation. You need to actually have a look. So you can't just be sat there glued to your plotter. And I mean, to be honest, most of us are most of the time. I come into places like here, actually, and I look at my chart plotter probably more than I look out at where I'm going or at my depth sounder. But in the Coral Islands, you really can't. You really have to be looking where you're going. That might mean someone at the very least stationed on the bow, stood on the pulpit, looking down. Or it might be someone maybe up at the spreaders. But you've got to look out where you're going. You need to use everything you can. The colour of the water. You need the sun to be high. You need to be really looking for it. And as Mike mentioned, Google Earth has kind of revolutionised life. You can get a snapshot from maybe as little as a year ago that shows where the coral reefs are. They're geo-referenced, so you can put them on your chart plotter. Your boat is still shown there, and you can see the reefs. It's not foolproof, but it helps.
One other topic I'd like to bring up, which is we're often asked, and it's quite difficult to answer, is money and budgets. Is what does it cost to go cruising? Can I ask the panel for their thoughts on how much they spent? Did you monitor what you spent, or did you just spend what you had? What was your approach to money?
Most cruisers try and ignore this question actually. They either don't know or they're really too afraid to tell you what they've spent. And it changes massively. I mean, it really does. There were boats that probably run at 10 times the budgets with us. I'm very lucky. I know exactly what we spent because we're a charter boat. We have paying clients. We have to budget it. So I know what we spend on food, fuel, everything. And our bill came to, it's about £5,000 a month. But we spend a lot of money running a boat as a charter boat. So we're probably at the higher end for the boat of our size. I don't know about you, Mike.
Yeah, I couldn't put a figure on it, I'm afraid. What I would say is that we did it with pensioners effectively, in terms of that we retired early, so we did it on a pension. And provided we didn't have to dip into our savings, then we were happy that that we were operating in a level that we could sustain. And across the Pacific, we did that. The one area, actually going back to the Caribbean, where we had struggle was during the cyclone or hurricane season. We went down to Trinidad and we ended up staying in Cruise Inn down in Chaguaramas, and that was lovely, but it drained the budget somewhat. But the Pacific, we were able to live within our means reasonably okay.
Yeah, so I'd just like to quantify, with our budget that I was mentioning, that includes all of the fees you'd be paying for something, like includes your insurance, it's an annual expense, and includes things like new mainsails when they're required, and it's a running budget, not just, that's what we spend every month and then we have to pay out for the big things. That's averaged over the year.
In our case, we knew we'd be starting in the Caribbean and finishing in Australia, so the actual cost of the voyage itself wasn't huge, and my crew were prepared to contribute towards food and so forth and fuel. The main cost was actually getting the boat ready for the trip. Had I done the ARC, the boat would have been completely up and running with the suitable life rafts and safety equipment. But because the boat had been brought from the States previously, I needed to get the boat up and running for the Pacific part of the crossing. And so there was a certain amount of expense getting that all sorted and getting everything in tip-top order, because I really felt that you could get away with just going between the Caribbean islands without all the safety equipment, but as soon as you started getting off from Panama, you needed to be absolutely together, and we needed a new dinghy. We got a second-hand life raft from somebody who was doing World Dark who had two, and there were quite a few spares we got, but we managed to get most of the spares in Panama tax-free, which was quite good. Luckily, when I actually got to Australia, the boat, we were lucky because the exchange rate had gone in our favour, and so we managed to sell the boat after 4 years, for the same amount in sterling as we paid for the boat 4 years earlier. So it worked out quite well.
Can I just ask a little bit on the money theme about the cost of living and food? Did you struggle to find the kind of things that you wanted to eat? What was your views on food in the Pacific? Was it expensive? Did you have to hunt around to get what you wanted? What was living out there?
Well, Mike was fairly accurate in that when everyone leaves from Panama, they fill up everything they can. We filled the freezer with meat, we filled the lockers with tins. We didn't take enough alcohol. When you get to French Polynesia, alcohol is very expensive. But it really depends. If you want to eat the same lifestyle and diet as you eat here, then you can expect it to cost a lot of money. If you're very happy to get involved with what locals are eating, catch fish, buy local things, then you can live very cheaply. It just depends on where you put that and how much of your time you spend cooking on board, preparing your own food versus eating out, and that's the huge difference really in what people spend.
Yeah, just one funny thing there that we noticed as we went across. When we started off from Panama, every time you met other yachts, who are talking about the maybe the coral reefs, the scenery, and everybody talking about that sort of thing. And after the long gap between any significant or serious shopping facilities, when we got to Tahiti, then the topic was not on the coral reefs, but it was on the supermarket that was just down the road that had got all these different cheeses and all sorts of things that we hadn't seen for ages and ages. So that was quite strange.
We were advised that everything was quite expensive in French Polynesia, so we made sure that we had all our dry provisions on the Atlantic side of Panama. We got all our fresh provisions, fresh vegetables and fruit when we were on the Pacific side. And we bought lots of cheap wine and beer in Panama, which was so much cheaper than the price in French Polynesia. But when we got further on towards the Cook Islands, we were pleasantly surprised because the price of food came down because it was all coming from places like New Zealand. So don't panic, it doesn't stay high, it goes down again because of the Australian and New Zealand influence.
We're almost out of time, so I'd kind of like to wrap up the conversation now and just ask you for cast your minds back to when you first set out on your respective voyages. What was the one thing you wish you'd known then that you know now? What's the sort of, is there one piece of advice you leave people with, or it might just be don't miss this particular place or buy one of these, or how would you sum up your sort of top piece of cruising advice, or favourite place to go?
From my point of view, I did the whole trip very quickly. It was more of a delivery than a voyage. And I would definitely spend more time. I ideally would like to spend 2 seasons in the Caribbean and possibly even leave my boat somewhere in the cyclone area. And there are a number of places where you can safely leave the boat if you do your homework. There are places in the Tuamotus, French Polynesia, in Raiatea, which is one of the islands in the French Polynesia, Fiji, New Caledonia, and Vanuatu, to name a few.
Well, I'm in a slightly different category because I haven't sailed across the Pacific in one go. I've done various ocean passages in the Pacific at different times and with different people on different boats. But I guess that would be the one thing. It's a place that I would like to go back to. I'd like to sail all the way across. I would like to take my time. If I did it again, I would not do it in one go. There's so much to see. I think that'll be my top tip, is if you really want to go there, take your time and really experience it.
Danny, top tip, favourite place, magic moment?
I tell you, it's very difficult to say that, to choose a favourite place. Probably for us it would be Suvaroff, which was in the Cook Islands. But that's only because we've been to all the other places and it was so different. It's an uninhabited island. Well, one guy lived there for a while, and there's occasionally a National Trust presence, but it is absolutely stunning. 600 miles from anywhere, no light pollution, manta rays and sharks beneath you, lovely stars, great place to be. But again, I think not rushing is the key. Once you get, it's quite a long way to get even to the Caribbean. Then you have your Pacific. Let's think of that as the best bit. And then once you get across to Australia, you've got quite a long way to get home, however you go. I mean, we've just shipped our boat, so it's gone now from Thailand to Turkey. We didn't really fancy the rest of the way. But however you do it, Red Sea's a bit dangerous, or you could go around the bottom of South Africa, but it's a long way. You're doing an awful lot of miles, when if you just skip the best bit in the Pacific, if you rush through, it almost feels like a delivery, so I would spend as long as you can there.
Top tip, favourite place,
Yeah,
magic moment?
one just quick comment on that. I mean, what we ended up doing was going across the Pacific to Tonga, and then from Tonga we went down to New Zealand. And then when we went back up to Minerva Reef and back up to Fiji. So we did the Fiji bit. That's why we were able to spend 4 months in Fiji, and then went on to Australia from there. So that sort of split it into 2 effectively, and gave us a bit more time. Top tips. One thing that we mentioned to someone earlier today on the boat. Don't fall into the trap of arranging for people to come and meet you at different places. It doesn't work. We did have my sister and cousin came out to see us in Tahiti, but they didn't put anything up until we got there, and then they used lastminute.com to get flights, etc. So they flew out when they knew we were there. And that's the way to do it. We've met so many people that have arranged for people to come and see them in Tahiti, to see them somewhere else, see them in South Africa, etc. And all they ended up doing was just tearing to get from one place to another. And that's not what you want. So just say, right, once I'm there, see what you can arrange. And that's the way to do it.
One final question is, why do you go blue water cruising? What is it that makes it for you?
I just love being out on the sea. I think the romance of it. I love being out at night. I do a lot of the. We do watches. We haven't sort of gone to watches, but we do 4 on, 4 off, 3 on, 3 off, and that seems to work quite well. But I love being out at night, and I love just being able to see the stars, and I just love the sound of the boat going through the water. And I just love being out there. That's my primary reason for doing it. But obviously I do love all the lovely places you see, the coral reefs that are there, the warm water. I'm one of these people that starts shivering when it goes below 25 degrees. So I just love it being warm.
Elaine, what would you sum up as joy of blue water cruising?
I'm very unromantic about it. I've come all full circle from all the things that Mike's talking about, and I do like and appreciate. But for me, a cruising yacht is a vehicle to get from A to B, and I think you should be hard-hearted about things. It's the places you visit, the people you see, and the contacts and the friends that you make along the way that are absolutely the number one thing about cruising. If I want to go sailing, I'll get a day boat, because that's really a hand on the tiller, that'll do me. It's the places. That's what it's all about.
Robert, do you want to sum up the joy of cruising?
I'm afraid I'm with Elaine on that. I like the places, and the getting the boat from A to B is. I do enjoy it, but I think arriving and seeing the places is fabulous. The mistake is to spend too much time in one place, because then you sort of get harbour bound, and the next thing you're doing is you're growing parsley in little boxes in the back of your on the stern, which is a really bad sign, because then you'll be there for months, and it's a real fuss trying to get away.
Yeah, any philosophical point to end the afternoon on?
I don't think so, really. I mean, the difference for me is that I do it because I don't really want to get a real job. So that's why I go out and do it. But I do love what I do, and it's a great thing to do. And I think the more people that go out and do it, the better. We're very lucky that we see a lot of people that don't necessarily want to do it as their main dream, people that want to come to the Pacific to see a leg. And so we get all sorts of people that aren't natural sailors that come and see it with us. And you really see the change in people. A month in the Pacific, seeing different people, the cultures, the lifestyle, the friendliness that Mike talked about. It's actually quite life-changing, and it's nice to see the change in the people that we get that see that kind of stuff. So, yeah, go and do it, definitely.